I'm going to introduce Tyler Kuliberda. He is with the National Park Service at Sagamore Hill, and he's going to be giving us a tour and some information about Sagamore Hill. So Tyler, I'm going to turn it over to you. I am just quickly before I do, if anybody has questions, you can type in the chat and we will try and go through them. If there's a break in the conversation, or if there are no breaks, then we will do it at the end of the program.
Theodore Roosevelt lived here in Oyster Bay. I'm in the back office, well, we call it the back office of the Roosevelt home currently. I've included on this title page here kind of a picture of the landscape in which Sagamore Hill, the home, sits on. It's a beautiful, picturesque landscape. If you haven't been out to Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, I highly recommend visiting in person. We have 83 acres here, which of course includes Roosevelt's home, but it also includes his son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s home, which we use as a visitor center. It has some museum exhibits as well. We also have a nice nature trail that goes down to the beach and a lot of exhibits around the house as well. And then, of course, presidential portraits. Roosevelt has a particularly interesting artist paint his, John Singer Sargent. And here's TR in kind of a commanding, typical pose that he would sit in. It's funny, you know, people today have kind of poses that I think they know work because they get pictures taken of them a lot with social media. And Roosevelt was doing the same thing back in 1902 when this portrait was painted. He kind of has this pose, he puts a hand on a hip, and he has this kind of fist in front, and you'll see him like that quite a bit. So Sagamore Hill, let's talk about why Oyster Bay. Let's talk about the outdoors at Sagamore Hill, which is, of course, why Theodore Roosevelt picked this spot. Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858 in Manhattan, and his house is still there. The house that he was born in is still there as a National Historic Site, the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. And why Oyster Bay? Why did he decide to settle in Oyster Bay? Well, he was born in a pretty sickly child. He had asthma, and his father was incredibly fond of his children, took very good care of them, and decided that he wanted to bring his son out into the country to help him get air, was the way that he put it, as frequently as he could. Born into a very wealthy family. The Roosevelts are an old Knickerbocker family, of Dutch lineage. And the family started renting homes in various places around New York City, like New Jersey or the Palisades, and, or even in the Hudson Valley, where the other Roosevelt family members were living. And at some point, they settle on Oyster Bay as kind of their main place to come out and enjoy the summer. So people today are usually summering in your neck of the woods in the Hamptons, and Oyster Bay was kind of like that for wealthy New Yorkers in Roosevelt's day. So in the 1870s, they're spending a lot of time in 1860s and 70s, they're spending a lot of time out in Oyster Bay. The Roosevelt family would rent a home called Tranquility, which is closer to Oyster Bay High School, if anybody is familiar with the area. And Roosevelt enjoys time out here. This is kind of where he gets his first taste of nature. His father knows that he's very interested in animals, and in their day, it usually meant hunting and taxidermy. So Roosevelt would go out on a boat and shoot wading birds and bring them back to stuff them and learn something about them too. You'd spend time horseback riding and hiking and kind of getting lost in the wilds of Oyster Bay, which is certainly not how we think of Oyster Bay anymore today. But nevertheless, when his father dies at a pretty young age, at the age of 41. Roosevelt decides to use some of the money that he inherited to purchase 155 acres here in Oyster Bay on top of a hill that overlooks the bay, the harbor, actually. So this is where he builds his home. The house that you can see here is sitting on top of what we can refer to as Sagamore Hill. And it's called Sagamore Hill because it apparently is the place where Sagamore Mohannis, which is a lesser chief of the Matinecock band of Native Americans, would have meetings. It was a high point And I think Roosevelt likes its association with leadership and decides to name it Sagamore Hill. In addition to the home on the hill, you also have, like I said, 83 acres. We still currently have 83 acres of the original estate, which includes farmlands, some gardens, an orchard, pastures, attractive woods, a salt marsh, which you can see at the bottom left, bottom right of the screen in autumn, and a beach on Cold Spring Harbor. So Roosevelt has a beautiful piece of land here. He says it's a piece of old-time America and calls it real country in a letter in his autobiography. And he really does adore the outdoors, and part of his reason for moving out here and establishing himself more or less permanently is to raise children and a family here. So if you look at the outside of the house, it could be just about anyone's house from this era. The house was built in 1885. It was finished. Roosevelt moved in soon thereafter with his second wife, Edith. I should mention that the house was originally planned with his first wife, Alice Lee Roosevelt. Alice died soon after giving birth to their first child, also named Alice, in 1884. And Roosevelt, very devastated, of course, by not only the loss of his wife, but also by his mother, who he lost on the same day, coincidentally. And Roosevelt's reaction to this is actually not what most people's reaction would be. It's to go throw himself into very hard, difficult work out in North Dakota. He decides that he's going to become a rancher. His previous job had been the New York State Assemblyman for his district in Manhattan. But he decides he's going to take on this very, very difficult work. He decides also to go through with the building of this home, which is very impractical for somebody who had just lost his wife and had kind of an uncertain status. But nevertheless, he rekindles a romance with a childhood friend, Edith Kermit Carew, who would become the First Lady and be his wife for the rest of his life. And they decide to go ahead with Sagamore Hill, and the house was originally supposed to be named Lee Home for Alice Lee, and they eventually decide to change the name. So like I was saying, not very distinct from the outside. It's a Queen Anne style home or a shingle styled house. Once you step inside though, it is a different story. This house is uniquely TR's. It is probably one of the most unique presidential homes in our country. Maybe one of the more unique homes that we have as a museum that you can visit in the home. And I think what I love about working here is that his personality comes through in the furnishings and the major decorations in the home so well that I get to tell the story of such a remarkable person who is very unique and very curious about the world. So this is the front hall. If you entered into the front of the home, this would be your first glance. You can tell a lot about this person. He certainly likes hunting. Most of the animals that you'll see in the home are from hunting trips from all over the world, most of them shot by TR. In this view, we have a white-tailed deer above a rhinoceros statue here. On the left-hand side, you have a Cape buffalo, and then in the foreground, the background rather, you have an oryx, an eland, and a timber wolf. And there are many more animal trophies and rugs as well, animal rugs, that we'll see on the tour of the home. So Roosevelt really loved hunting. I will certainly talk about that more in depth as far as him being a conservationist. It's probably one of the more controversial things that we talk about on our house tour is how did this person who shot all these animals, how is he also responsible for things like America's National Wildlife Refuge System and many national parks and national monuments in places where wildlife was preserved. So it's an interesting question that I'm sure we'll get into later. Heavy oak paneling on the walls. So this is a fairly dark space. In his day, it was lit by gas, so gas lit. So it would have been a pretty dark space. I forgot to mention during the opening that Sagamore Hill was the first summer White House. And what that means is Roosevelt would come home during the summer times during his presidency. He was president from 1901 to to 1909, and continued to run the business of the executive branch from his home. No president had ever done that before. Most presidents before him had a break for the summer. They would stop work altogether. They'd go home for a few months, and then they would pick up work again in September or October. Roosevelt decided that many things in the national situation had changed as far as picking up new territories after the Spanish-American War, and also technology was able to keep him in touch with not only Washington but the rest of the world. So there is a telephone at Sagamore Hill. So if we on our tour, it's difficult for me to separate myself from the actual physical room. So you might hear me say, if we turn to our right here, even though I'm just going to forward the next slide. So on the right-hand side, you would see the library, and this is looking from the entranceway. If you were coming to conduct business with the president, you would be doing it in this room. So during usually the morning hours, Roosevelt would come in here early. His secretary of staff would come in with him, and they would read briefings from different departments. They would conduct any official business, like of appointments of like postmasters or anything of that nature, and anything else that was very pressing. I don't want to give you the impression that Roosevelt worked entirely very hard from this room, because this was summer and they were usually finished by midday. Roosevelt was certainly trying to spend time with his family. He was trying to spend time out of doors, trying to spend time with his wife. And Sagamore Hill was perfect for that because they have horses. They love to go horseback riding. They could go hiking. They could go down to their beach. Roosevelt's favorite activity on the beach was rowing. So not a sailor so much as somebody who liked to row. He was on the sculling team at Harvard University. And he very much enjoyed these very laborious activities. You should not get the impression by the end of the day that these people sat around on their porch drinking lemonade, chatting with their guests. Roosevelt, for fun, would chop down trees or ride his horse very hard, or even row across Long Island Sound to Connecticut. So Roosevelt advocated for what he called the strenuous life, and he certainly practices it. So I'll talk a little bit about this room and what we see in it. If you can see on the desk here, there is a telephone. I talked about being in contact with the rest of the country to be very important to the Roosevelt family. We mentioned that he's certainly a hunter. He's certainly somebody who's interested in going out west on adventures, on challenging himself. I mentioned that he was a sickly boy. So I think some of his hunting comes out of the fact that he was trying to overcome that illness of asthma and being fairly weak as a boy. His father challenged him to make his body. He said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body, and that you will have to build yourself." And Roosevelt takes that very seriously. He takes his father's advice seriously, and he goes out west as a young man and goes on these adventures. He certainly is, hunting these animals. One of his goals is probably to get every big game animal in the United States. It's kind of a collection. And then he starts to take that into other countries or continents like Africa and also South America. Some of his hunting is done for scientific reasons, believe it or not. So it's certainly something he enjoys doing. It's for fun, but sometimes he is undertaking an expedition for the American Museum of Natural History here in New York, or the Smithsonian Institute, the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. So he is sometimes in their employ and bringing back specimens for scientific study, which many of which we still have today. In addition to hunting, Roosevelt certainly liked books. I'm going to pan around to a different view, but we're still in the library. We have about 8,000 books at Sagamore Hill, and Roosevelt was an avid reader. He read about a book a day. He had a very unique talent in that he was a speed reader. I studied English when I was in college, and I certainly wish I could read a book a day. I'm actually a pretty slow reader. But Roosevelt always had a book in his hands. In fact, we have a really nice picture of he and Edith in their later years, where it's supposed to be a nice portrait of husband and wife. And Roosevelt, if you look at his hand, in his lap, he has a book with his finger slid in between the pages, which indicates that he was reading, had to keep his space in the book, and then would presumably go back to reading afterward. So he also, in addition to being an avid reader, was also a writer. He wrote over 30 books during his lifetime, and was well known by the public as an author. He's not very well read today, but he writes an autobiography is probably his most famous written work. Of course, you have a number of histories, biographical works about different figures. He writes a lot about his own political philosophy and his experiences, and he fills up well over 30 books. So in addition to working as a public servant, which doesn't pay all that well, Roosevelt makes most of the money for the family as an author. He spends his inheritance very quickly on Sagamore Hill, his ranching endeavor, and some other very expensive purchases. He would not consider himself a businessman, nor would his wife, Edith, who managed the family's money. Above the bookshelves here, you have typical art that Roosevelt liked to collect. He loved bronze statues. I tell people if you like to get him a birthday present, you can get him a bronze statue. He certainly loved them. And the subject matter of the statues is usually a man on a horse doing some kind of daring deed, or an animal like the panther here stalking, which was a gift of his, what he called his tennis cabinet. And then above it, you have some other pieces of art hanging on the wall. You have some heroes of his. The large portrait on the left-hand side above the panther is his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. I want to talk about him a little bit more in depth, but I'll talk about some of the other portraits that are on the wall. You, of course, next to his father on his left, have Abraham Lincoln. On the right, General and President Ulysses S. Grant. John C. Marshall next to him, who was a Supreme Court Justice. You have George Washington. So these are all leaders of the country. You get a sense that Roosevelt certainly admires these people and aims himself towards their kind of career. You have, if you want to go to the next side of the wall, you have a mountain goat shot by Roosevelt, and then next to him is a portrait of Sir Thomas More. Why Sir Thomas More? I don't know. I don't really know. Roosevelt doesn't really write a lot about him, and we don't have any letter or anything that describes why he decided to hang a portrait in the room. So let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt's father. So also Theodore Roosevelt, we call him Theodore Roosevelt Sr. You rarely hear the president referred to as Theodore Roosevelt Jr., and I think that probably has something to do with the fact that his father died before Roosevelt entered the working world. So he never had need to just distinguish himself from his father. Roosevelt said that his father was the greatest man he ever knew. I think a lot of us feel that way about our parents. We feel very fondly about them, but I believe that Roosevelt really, truly meant it. His father was a wealthy New Yorker who, if you asked him what his profession was, he would probably tell you that he was a philanthropist, although he worked in banking, and their family business that actually made most of their money was in hardwares and importing plate glass to the United States. So Theodore Roosevelt Sr., as a philanthropist, worked with many different foundations and groups, giving money and supporting their causes. He worked with Museum of Natural History in New York City to actually establish the museum. He would give money to the Children's Orthopedic Hospital in New York City. I should say that Roosevelt's sister, who we call Bammy, her name is Anna, she has a spinal deformity. So I think Roosevelt's father is very sympathetic to children with special needs. And he also gives money for lodging for orphans. New York City had a kind of an epidemic of orphan children on the streets. So Roosevelt will join his father very frequently in feeding orphan children at the Newsboys Lodging Home. I think Roosevelt, this humbles him. He goes with his father. He sees how Roosevelt's friend Jacob Riis says the other half lives. And I think his father teaches him something of service without self-interest. The idea that you can do something to benefit others but not necessarily benefit yourself. And Roosevelt, I think, takes this mentality, this kind of moralistic mentality into his career as a public servant. Do we have any questions in the chat? If not, that's okay. You can hold it.
It doesn't look like yet, so I'd say just continue on.
All right, we'll do. So this is the drawing room. This is Mrs. Roosevelt's domain in the home. This is across the hall from the library, and compared to the hallway, the library, and the other rooms that we're going to see on the tour, this room is certainly the outlier. This is certainly reflective of a different person's personality. Although there are some animal skins in the room, you can't see them all that well from this angle, but there's a polar bear at the bottom left-hand part of the screen. You can see its leg here. It's a pretty impressive gift. It's a gift from Admiral Perry. You have a mountain lion, some bears, and another mountain lion. So even Mrs. Roosevelt can't escape the taxidermy in the house. But this reflects her personality very well, I would say. Mrs. Roosevelt certainly appreciated privacy, whereas her husband, I think, was more of the life of the party, or at least more social. Whereas Mrs. Roosevelt, I think, was pretty quiet and enjoyed reading, and certainly tried to safeguard the family's privacy here at Sagamore Hill, which was very difficult. They have 6 children. Their names are Alice, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Kermit, Archie, Quentin, and Ethel, not necessarily in that order. These kids were, constantly playing around the outside. Sometimes reporters would sneak onto the property to try to get like a funny headline that they could put in the newspaper. So Mrs. Roosevelt kind of had a difficult go of protecting this family's privacy. While her husband runs the country across the hallway, Mrs. Roosevelt runs Sagamore Hill. I mentioned earlier that Roosevelt was certainly not a businessman. He really had no mind for managing his own pocketbook. So that's where Mrs. Roosevelt comes in and does a pretty deft job at making sure that the family doesn't go broke. And I say it that way because although his family was wealthy, Roosevelt doesn't do much in his lifetime to kind of maintain that wealth. He just doesn't have the mind for business. He doesn't have the drive for making money. He's more interested in public service, more interested in writing and intellectual pursuits. So Mrs. Roosevelt has to kind of very safely safeguard their money. And she would probably work at the other side of the room here at the desk against the window. Children were typically not allowed in this room without permission. So Mrs. Roosevelt, as her son Archie says, takes no prisoners, and was certainly the disciplinarian at home, whereas their father, I think they probably looked at as kind of a playmate and more of a companion. There's this great story of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. catching mackerel offshore here in Oyster Bay or Cold Spring Harbor, and being very excited about them, bringing them in on a stringer to the house, bringing them in to show his mother in the drawing room here, and dropping them all over the floor. He describes it as this kind of shiny, silvery things wiggling all over the floor here, which I think horrified Mrs. Roosevelt. I'm going to move along to the next room in the home. And this one is the most impressive in the house. So this is the north room. And it was an addition to Sagamore Hill. Sagamore Hill was a pretty small home when it was first built. It was really meant to be an escape from New York City, not the primary residence, but it ends up becoming that. Roosevelt really never owns another significant piece of property anywhere in his adult life. So this is added during Roosevelt's presidency, and I think it gives people a sense of grandeur, and it's meant to certainly impress people who walk into it or see it. So we have to consider that the rest of the house was built as kind of the summer home of a wealthy man, but this room was built for President of the United States. So there are gifts in the room from all over the country and all over the world. What was done in this room was you would have meetings in here. I imagine a lot of the business that was originally conducted in the library could have been moved over to this part of the home. If you had a party, it may mainly take place in this room. We know that the children will have dances at the house, and they will kind of move the furniture aside to the back of the room and roll up the rug. We have something that describes Theodore Roosevelt doing the Virginia reel, which is kind of like a square dance in this room, which I can hardly imagine. I'll go around the room here and point out some of the significant gifts. I have them on different slides, and I'm going to come back to a similar slide of the room here. And if anybody has any questions about this room and the things that are in it, please feel free to ask. There's a lot in this room, and I can't possibly cover all of it. So you may have noticed an elk with a sword and a hat on its antlers. I think Roosevelt put it there for it to stand out. It was certainly something that he wanted people to ask him about, and something he wanted to talk about at length when he had visitors to the house. So it's one of his most prideful points of his life is his time in the Army as a cavalryman, a volunteer in the Spanish-American War with the Rough Riders. This is really the event that makes him famous to the entire country. So the Spanish-American War breaks out in 1898. Roosevelt is serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. And he decides to leave his post, which is a civilian post, to join the volunteer cavalry because he wants to be in the action. There's actually a pretty unfortunate quote of his that says, I would leave my wife's bedside if fighting broke out. And that's pretty much what he did. His family had just had their last child, Quentin, and Roosevelt a couple months later would go to the fighting in Cuba. Roosevelt was looking, I think, to prove himself in a war, to kind of test his mettle. He had very distinct opinions about war and thought that it was kind of the ultimate test of manhood. And certainly instilled those values in his children. All of his children, all of his boys, I should say, go to the First World War and serve in the fighting there. So Roosevelt has what he calls his crowded hour on July 1st, 1898. He orders the Rough Riders as their colonel to charge and take Spanish machine guns positions atop Kettle Hill during the Battle of San Juan Heights. And people who are into military history will tell you that it was kind of a crazy maneuver, but nevertheless, Roosevelt was successful. Many Rough Riders had died because of the maneuver, but Roosevelt ended up taking the hill, and very soon after became very well known in the country. So he became an instant hero that was, he was kind of propelled into the national consciousness by newspapers, and there was a lot of newspaper men in the time actually at the war, and were sending dispatches back to the US and publishing things more or less as they took place. So it was very much a kind of an early modern war. So Roosevelt becomes nationally famous. He runs for governor when he gets back to New York. Actually, I should bring up, because you guys are in are in Southampton. The Rough Riders, after their service in the war, were quarantined at Montauk, at a place called Camp Wyckoff. And the reason they were quarantined is because of yellow fever, which was rampant in Cuba. And they didn't realize that it wasn't a communicable disease, that you had to get it from a mosquito bite. So the Rough Riders would quarantine out Montauk. They would be mustered out of service. They would give Roosevelt a gift that I'm going to show you in a moment. And Roosevelt would run for governor of New York the same year and win. So he runs as a Republican, he wins, and in his service as governor, he, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of a moralist. He's a reformer. And this really angers people in the Republican Party in New York. They're used to machine politics, to patronage, and to following kind of the orders of the boss, where Roosevelt really doesn't do much of that. He starts reforming a lot of institutions within the state. He starts creating certain kinds of laws that would assist labor and create certain kind of regulations within business and food. And they decide that they need to do something to get this man out of the top executive position in the state. So in order to do that, there was an opening for vice president. Garrett Hobart, who was the vice president of the United States, had died during William McKinley's first term. And who better to put in his place than a war hero that most of the country liked? So Roosevelt runs for vice president, something that he is not crazy about. In fact, at the convention, he does not vote for himself. He's the one vote against Theodore Roosevelt, but to the delight of the Republicans of New York State, he wins with William McKinley and has to go, of course, to Washington. The end of that story is he, of course, eventually becomes president. So Theodore Roosevelt will become president because William McKinley is killed during the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. And Roosevelt ascends to the presidency, and Republican bosses will, of course, remark, now that damn cowboy's in the White House. Yeah, Mark Hanna, I think, is quoted with that. So speaking of cowboys, you have a gift of the Rough Riders on the left-hand side of the screen here. This sits above the mantle in the North Room. And this is the Bronco Buster by Frederick Remington. It's one of the most famous pieces of art in the home. This has been replicated many times over. I was at the Grand Canyon a couple of years ago. I went out to eat dinner and I walked past this enormous statue at the restaurant that we're walking into. And of course, it's an exact replica, of course, life size of the Bronco Buster. And I said, I know what that is. If you look at photographs of most presidents from John F. Kennedy on, in the background in the Oval Office, if they're on the phone or sitting in the chair in the desk there, you'll see this in the background. So this is a statue, a replica, excuse me, another casting of the statue sits often at the White House. On the right-hand side, you have a bison head, and there are two bison heads in the North Room. Both of them shot by Roosevelt in the 1880s as a young man when he goes out to the Dakota Territory. My opinion is he goes to the Dakota Territory to kind of go on a lengthy hunting trip, not so much work as a cattle rancher. But he hires a guide and he wants bison trophies for Sagamore Hill. And one of the things he notices is that they're very hard to find because they had been really kind of wiped out. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop Roosevelt from shooting these two, but it certainly makes him think about where bison will be in a generation, if there will be any left. And when Roosevelt returns home to New York eventually, he contacts friends who would eventually found the Bronx Zoo. During his presidency, he gets in contact with them again, and they decide that they're going to make this really daring conservation effort to raise bison at the zoo and then put them on rail cars and ship them out to the plains to help bolster the numbers of the herds. And Roosevelt, as president, would establish a national bison range in Oklahoma. And eventually they would build up a good population. And because of these conservation efforts and other conservation laws, we still have bison in this country today. And you can go out and see them in Yellowstone National Park or various parks and places across the West. This is probably our most iconic animal as a country. I have a badge on that says Department of Interior. It has a bison on it. Roosevelt, when he goes to the White House, he has a major renovation done. They actually add the West Wing during his time in the White House. And one on the mantelpieces in the White House, they come with designs, and one of them is a lion's head that they were going to put on the corners of the mantle. And Roosevelt says, now we should have a North American animal, and actually has them cast a bison head on the mantles there. So again, this man who does all this hunting, kills many animals, is also responsible for saving quite a bit of them and saving quite a bit of land. Roosevelt would conserve over 230 million acres of land during his presidency, which was well more than any president had before him. He was really the first conservation president in our nation's history, and he popularized the movement. He was the first person with any real degree of power to implore the populace to conserve natural resources and wildlife. In addition to saving bison, Roosevelt was also very passionate about birds. He was an expert birder, an audubonist, I think is what he would call it in his day. Today we call it birding, we call him a birder. So Roosevelt would create what we refer to as national wildlife refuges today. And he creates the first one at Pelican Island. He's sitting with a number of men in the government, having a meeting of the cabinet, and he asks if there's anything that he can do to save a place where wading birds breed in Florida, Pelican Island. And he asks, is there any law in the books that prevents me from declaring a wildlife refuge? And somebody tells him no. And then he says, well, then I do so declare it. And this is kind of the basis for protecting wildlife for the sake of protecting them, not necessarily giving access as we would in a national park, but just to have places for animals to continue to live and reproduce on their own. Roosevelt also saves quite a few places as national monuments, and I have a close-up here of a painting in the North Room. This is, of course, the Grand Canyon, and I hope that some of you have been there. Roosevelt would recommend that any American who is able to see it should go and see it. He gets to go for the first time after reading about it as a boy in 1903. And he makes a speech from the rim while he's there. He's on a whistle-stop tour of the United States. And he tells the people who've gathered there to listen to him, who are native Arizonans. Arizona is not yet a state. It's still a territory. And some of them are probably thinking about the mining they could do in the canyon. Some of them are probably thinking about becoming running hotels at the rim, maybe bringing the train, the railroad to the rim. Some of them are probably eager to charge tolls on roads that go into the canyon. And Roosevelt tells this crowd, leave this place as it is. He says, the ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Leave it for your children, and your children's children, and all that come after you. When he gets back to Washington, 3 years later, Congress hands the president the power to declare national monuments at a stroke of a pen. It's using an act called the Antiquities Act, which is still used by presidents today to declare national monuments. And the most recent wasn't declared very long ago. So Roosevelt creates Grand Canyon National Monument. He also creates Devil's Tower, El Morro, Muir Woods. He creates about 18 national monuments during his presidency. And he signs into law about 5 national parks. He creates the United States Forest Service. And when it's all said and done, it's about 230 million acres of land for the American public. So here is another view of the North Rim. And you can see that the Grand Canyon painting is hanging up near the bison. You have Roosevelt's portrait here as the Rough Rider, which is painted by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt sat for the portrait when he was in the White House, so a few years after his Rough Riding days. You have very large elephant tusks that were given by Emperor Menelik II of Abyssinia, and they were a gift to Roosevelt for winning the 1904 election. And my understanding is that the elephant wasn't a wild elephant. It was actually living in a private zoo of the emperors, and when it had died, he had sent Roosevelt their tusks. Any questions about the North Room and the things in it?
We do have one question. Craig would like to know, did Thomas Moran paint the Grand Canyon painting?
No, he didn't, but the person who did was Lucian Powell, no relation to Major Powell, who would go on the expedition down the Colorado River. But he was a student of Thomas Moran, so that's certainly a good point. He's certainly trying to copy his style. And it's interesting, Roosevelt has a number of nice paintings, really remarkable paintings in the home, but none of them are by famous artists. And I think that speaks to his status level. He was wealthy, but he wasn't so wealthy that he could go out and buy the Thomas Moran painting or the famous European paintings. But nevertheless, I think he had good taste in art. And when he put something in the home, it was because he genuinely really loved it. So some of the artwork in the house, let me go back to a previous slide here. So above the mantle here, you have this very beautiful painting. It's called Where Shadow and Light Meet, and it's not of any particular place in reality. It's kind of a fantasy drawing, and excuse me, a painting. And there are a number of other paintings by the same artist, who's P. Marcus Simons, who's a German-born, eventually emigrated to the United States and became an American. And Roosevelt really just adores his style. He's kind of impressionistic, but kind of also doing these kind of heightened reality paintings. And I think Roosevelt really enjoys that kind of epic nature in his art. I think the most famous artist that we have in the house is probably Frederick Remington, who's pretty well known for his depictions of the American West. There's a couple other famous artists from his time, like Augustus St. Gaudens. There's a statue in the home. Roosevelt knew St. Gaudens as a friend as well. Good question, thank you. Okay, so move ahead to the dining room here. So the dining room, it's a small table, and it's a pretty small room. If I was taking this picture, if I turned around, my back would be at the entranceway. So this is certainly not a grand room for entertaining. It's a place for intimate conversation. And that was kind of the tone at the Roosevelt's home. It wasn't a place where they had kind of large parties or banquets or places to kind of show off and demonstrate their wealth. It was a place for people to come and maybe have an intellectual conversation, or for him to get to know somebody from another country who was representing their country to the United States. So Roosevelt would sit at the head of this table. Edith would sit on the opposite end near that moose head and the screen back there. And then on a typical night, you would have maybe a guest or two. And you'd probably have some of the children sitting around the table as well. The table, I think, during the presidency was probably a larger one. I believe this table was purchased on their honeymoon in Florence, Italy. And the table that was probably here during the presidency, we do not possess. So I imagine there were probably a few more spots at the table for people to sit at. The children were at the table with the adults as soon as they were able to feed themselves. So Roosevelt also encouraged them to contribute to the conversation. He kind of expected his children to kind of be interested in world affairs and things like that, and be able to kind of hold their own in a conversation. So what did they eat here at Sagamore Hill? Well, they do have a farm, so they're able to grow vegetables. They have cows, chickens, pigs, rabbits. So of course, producing some meat, but also dairy and eggs on the farm here. They would often get very excited about vegetables come spring, because these are people who didn't really have access to fresh vegetables over the winter. They had to kind of pickle everything or can everything. And then, of course, when asparagus became available in the spring, they were very excited about that. Also, the farm superintendent, a man named Noah Seaman, we have letters where he and Mrs. Roosevelt are corresponding, and Mrs. Roosevelt will ask him to send certain foods to the White House, So they were very fond of their farm, their garden here. It was kind of a hobbyist farm. It wasn't, they certainly didn't send things to market. It was just really for themselves. And they aren't entirely self-sufficient. They would go into town to Oyster Bay to purchase meats and other supplies that they just couldn't produce here on the farm. So Roosevelt's favorite food to serve is fried chicken with white gravy and grits, which is kind of an unusual dish for somebody from New York, somebody from the North. It's considered more of a Southern cuisine. And why is that? Well, Roosevelt's mother is from the South. Mittie Roosevelt and Martha Roosevelt is from Roswell, Georgia, and grows up eating that way, and it kind of becomes a thing in the Roosevelt home. So Roosevelt likes this kind of hearty style of food. And Roosevelt we think of as probably a pretty fit person, but after his presidency, he starts to gain weight, and I think it's from eating all these very kind of coarse and hearty foods. His daughter Alice says, yes, father likes coarse foods and plenty of them. So she's kind of not afraid to make fun of her own dad. Through the screen there, you would have servants coming in and out of that doorway in the back left corner of the room. So servant staff, and I'm going to move ahead to the next room, the kitchen, show you where they would have been working. The servants, they have about 12 people who work for them. Some of them are farm hands, usually men who work out on the farm. Usually women would work inside the home, usually single women. Many of them immigrants, some of them coming over from Ireland and working in wealthy folks' homes in New York City and also across Long Island. So the two cooks who worked here were Irish women. They were sisters, Katie and Annie O'Rourke. And they cooked not only here, but they also went to the White House. So you can see some examples of food on the table here. And these things were mostly found or grown at Sagamore Hill. So you have watermelons, you have potatoes, you have some eggs there, and you also have oysters, so very appropriate for Oyster Bay, where you could get an abundance of shellfish basically in your backyard. So Roosevelt would often invite people to lunch and dinner on a whim if he went into town. And sometimes they would have to change up their menu very quickly on the fly. Every day, farmhands would leave a basket of vegetables and things from the farm at the back door, and they were used to prepare meals for the family. The two cooks would get up around 6 o'clock in the morning. They would light the fire on this coal and wood-fired stove, and that fire wouldn't go out all day. So they cooked breakfast for the family. After they cooked breakfast, they began preparing lunch. And after lunch, it was time to start thinking about dinner. The servants worked very long hours. They probably worked at least 12 hours a day, if not longer. They had off on Sunday mornings to go to church, so they worked very hard. But Roosevelt is remarked in interviews that we have with people who used to work for the family, or in letters, or there was even a servant who would write a book about his experience working for Theodore Roosevelt, a man by the name of James Amos, who was an African American. And they don't say that he was pretty fair and paid them well and all around pretty nice guy to work for. There are stories of him letting the servants go to a party at the next estate over, and allowing them to prepare meals early so they could get over there at a reasonable hour. James Amos is particularly interesting. He writes a book called A Hero to His Valet, referring to Theodore Roosevelt, of course. James Amos was an African-American who begins working for Roosevelt at the White House. They get along so well that Roosevelt asks him if he would come to work at Sagamore Hill for him after the White House. James works for him for another 5 years or so, and then decides that he really wants more out of his life. He asks Roosevelt for a letter of reference, and he becomes a private detective essentially becomes a Pinkerton detective with the Pinkerton agency. and then parlays that into a career with the early Federal Bureau of Investigation. He becomes one of the earliest African-American special agents in the FBI. I'll mention technology here in the kitchen. The house is built again in 1885, and for its time, they had fairly modern technology. You can see a faucet on the left-hand side here, 2 faucets. There's a tank here with pipes. In the back of the home, there's an ice house where they kept ice, and beyond that is a windmill. The windmill would pump a well and send water up to the 3rd floor of Sagamore Hill into a 300-gallon water tank that then was fed by gravity to all the faucets in the house, as well as a bathroom. They had a bathroom with a flush toilet and a tub. So for 1885, these Roosevelts were living pretty well in their home. Well, most people of their day would have had to use an outhouse or draw their water from a pump. That is the last room on our tour. Here's another, just from the other angle here. I'll bring up that you have a table with the red and white checkered tablecloth here. That was where servants would typically eat after they were done serving the family. An interesting, funny story is children sometimes would eat at that table if they were not well behaved or if they were late for dinner. Kind of the sentence was to go to the kitchen. They had to do whatever the servants asked them to do, and then they could eat after the servants were finished eating. So it was pretty, they're pretty strict about being dressed and being on time to dinner at the home. So I want to try to save some time for questions. I'll just wrap up by saying that Roosevelt home is certainly remarkable. It's kind of a private home of a public man, and you get a sense of him very well by looking around the house. I hope that all of you at some point will get a chance to visit in person if you haven't already. Any questions?
We do have a question from Catherine. She wants to know if there's any artifacts at Sagamore Hill from Roosevelt's Amazonian expedition.
There is one I can think of on display, and it is in the North Room. And I will try to show it to you. We have a 360 tour that I will tell you about in a moment. I can't quite get to it. Here we go. So we can actually click around the house like this. I didn't want to give the entire tour like this because it's a little clunky. It's easier to just have a still photo. But this animal skin here is a jaguar that was shot in the Amazon. And the Amazon was quite a harrowing trip. Many people who are familiar with Roosevelt will say that it was a trip that almost killed him, and it's certainly true. Roosevelt goes to the Amazon, if you're not familiar with the story, at the age of 53. Roosevelt died at the age of 60, by the way. So Roosevelt, as an older man, will go to the Amazon to chart a river called the River of Doubt, which is not an ironic name. It's a river that they honestly do not have on the maps yet. And he goes with Colonel Rondon, who is a pretty high-ranking official in the Brazilian military. And they go on this pretty harrowing journey down this river on dugout canoes. They're shot at by indigenous people during their travels. Roosevelt comes down with malarial fever and assumes that he will die in the jungle. He tells his son Kermit, who joined him on the travels, that he was going to take a lethal dose of morphine that he brought with him. And Kermit is able to convince his father not to take it, and by saying something along the lines of, whether you are living or dead, I am going to take your body out of here. And I think Roosevelt understands that he'd become quite burdensome to his son if he didn't try to push through. So yeah, that's the only thing I can think of in the house that's on display from the Amazonian trip. And here's another view. I'll swing around the North Room here. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a few that are popping in. Carrie wants to know, were there motor cars or a garage on the property?
That's a good question. There was. Eventually. So Roosevelt is kind kind of born in an interesting time. I mean, he grows up in the era just before the Civil War, and during the end of his life, you have, I should say, he lives until 1919. He dies at the age of 60, so he doesn't die a very old man. So yes, the Roosevelts did purchase a vehicle, I think in probably 1917 or 1918, and had it in their carriage house. Roosevelt apparently didn't really like cars. He was very fond of horses and horseback riding. He said, "With a horse, you have a friend." And the story goes that apparently the car, he was not very adept at operating it and crashed it in a small ditch. And his son, Quentin, who was very mechanically inclined, fixed up the car and basically told his father that he would have to ask permission to drive it from there forward. So yes, we do have vehicles, although Roosevelt wasn't particularly fond of them. I think he preferred horses.
I have another one. Are any of the bedrooms set up as part of the regular in-person tour?
They are. The reason I didn't go into the bedrooms today is I wanted to really spend the bulk of our time talking about the main rooms in the house. The bedrooms are, certainly interesting. You have about 11 bedrooms in the home. So we have a second and third floor. The children do not all have their own bedrooms. They very often shared rooms until they got older, and then they kind of started to spread throughout the house. I think at the end, they probably all had their own bedroom if they would move out of the house already. And then you have a number of rooms for servants on the third floor. Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt share a room, which isn't always the case for married couples in this age. So yeah, those are certainly available to view on a regular tour of Sagamore Hill. And I'm going to share the URL for the virtual tour that I was just clicking through. And you can see them on the second floor of that tour as well. I'll share that in a moment.
Does the virtual tour include the grounds and the beach?
I don't know that it goes all the way down to the beach. It may. It's been a while since I clicked around on all of the features of it. But it does have some of the grounds here for sure. We have a lot of photos on our website of the grounds. We have a lot of, we also have social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So if you're on any of those, we take pictures all the time. So those are good things to kind of scan if you're curious.
Craig, go ahead and ask your question.
Is any of the house designed by people that were also designing houses for the government in Washington? Who designed the house? Is it one person, many people? And are these people also people that are designing things for the government in DC?
So the original architects of the home is a firm from New York City called Lamb and Rich. I'm not very familiar with them. And then the designer of the architect for the North Rooms was named Grant Lafarge. And I know Grant Lafarge had some architectural designs in New York City that became famous. I think some of them were subway stations and things of that nature, public works. But I don't think that any of them were designing places in Washington, but don't quote me on, I'm not exactly certain.
Anna would like to know when Sagamore Hill will fully reopen to visitors.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one we're tackling right now. I think we'll see it open next month. Myself and the other staff here are trying to figure out ways to modify our tours just for COVID and safety's sake. Because we're a federal government entity, we can't require people to share vaccination status, which means that we need to take preventative measures for our staff when doing tours. So I think we're going to see tours with limited numbers. You'll have to reserve in advance. And let's hope that our COVID cases keep trending downward, and maybe we'll get back to normal sooner rather than later. But I think we'll see the house reopen next month. Check our website.
I did have a question from Christine. She apologized for popping in late. She just wanted to know if there were any rooms that have Mrs. Roosevelt's personality. If you could maybe pop back to
Sure.
her room. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to show you the drawing room, and that's a great question because so much of the house is really Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's home. But this is the drawing room. This is kind of the best illustration of Mrs. Roosevelt's personality. Mrs. Roosevelt, I had mentioned during the tour, was very private, and I think this room kind of reflects her privacy. It doesn't really show off very much of her personality. She was very much a woman of her time. I think she thought that her duties were to her husband and to her children, and she certainly was a great advisor to Theodore Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt had difficulty discerning people's true intentions with him, and you can imagine as president, you probably have some people who have less than on the level intentions when talking to somebody of power. I think Mrs. Roosevelt was very frank with him about people who maybe were trying to get something out of him or something like that. So she was a great companion to her husband. They both loved books. They loved reading. Mrs. Roosevelt really adores poetry, and is, like I said, the kind of the mistress of Sagamore Hill, the person who really kind of runs the house for the benefit of her children and her husband.
Looks like I have one last question from Carla. When did the house leave the family's ownership, and are any of his progeny still living?
Yes, so his progeny still living. There's still a young man, I think he's in his 40s, who is Theodore Roosevelt V. He had 6 children, and all of them, aside from his son Quentin, who was killed in the First World War, have kids themselves. So yes, certainly many other people descended from the president still alive. None of them live in Oyster Bay, to my knowledge. I believe some of them live in New York City or various places throughout the country. I forget the first part of the question. There was
it was, when did the house leave the family's ownership?
Yeah, so Mrs. Roosevelt lived a long life compared to her husband. She lived until 1947. She was, I believe, in her 80s when she died. Excuse me, she died in 1948. I'm getting mixed up. So I think she died at the age of 87, and she probably would really hated the idea that people are walking around her house. But her children sold the house to the Theodore Roosevelt Association because they wanted it as a museum. They had already acquired Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace and showed that as a museum, and they wanted the same for his home. When Mrs. Roosevelt died, only 3 of her children are still alive. 3 of her children had died previous to her passing. So I think these people were all very well established. They kind of had their own homes, their own families, their own lives. I think to take on another home or inherit it would have just been impractical. So they sell it to the Theodore Roosevelt Association in 1953. They open it as a museum in the same year. And then the association finds it fairly difficult to maintain and run. So they give it to the federal government. It becomes a National Historic Site in 1962.
And looks like we just got lots of thank you for the presentation. They loved hearing about his life and the home.
Yes.
We even had some people visiting us from the UK.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so everybody really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. It's certainly nice to give a tour. We aren't giving many of them now. We give them to whatever place kind of wants a virtual tour. I'll leave you with a few things before I say goodbye. You have some public sites that you can visit. Sagamore Hill, of course, is one of them, but you also have his birthplace. Theodore Roosevelt was inaugurated in Buffalo after William McKinley was killed. There's a national park named after him in North Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt National Park. In Washington, D.C., you have Theodore Roosevelt Island. So there's a monument to him in D.C. not many people are familiar with. His grave is just down the road in Young Cemetery. And the American Museum of Natural History in New York has the Theodore Roosevelt Rotunda and an exhibit on him on their bottom floor. So if you're interested in TR, some other places to visit. And I'll leave you with the address for Google Arts and Culture. If you're not familiar with it, get interested. You can see a lot of museum exhibits there. If you search for Sagamore Hill, you can do those virtual tours that I was working through.
And can you also just provide, never mind, it's up there, the website for Sagamore Hill itself from the Park Service?
Right. So mps.gov/Sagamore Hill will get you there. And yeah, check out our website. There's a lot more to see on there if you're interested.
All right. Well, thank you, Tyler, so much for a great presentation. And thank you, everybody, for Zooming in with us. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you for having me. Take care. Bye.
Bye.